Well, good morning, Fire Hall. Good morning, Warehouse, and all those of our friends up at Churchill, everybody watching online, listening on the podcast, and of course here at the factory. Welcome to the launch of a brand new series called Unapologetic. A bit of a play on words as we are going to be studying apologetics for the next 6 weeks. And I hope you came ready with a pen and a Bible and paper in your bulletin. You can grab that. You're going to want to write some stuff down today. It was interesting. This last week I discovered a club for pastors. And it's actually called the Clergy Project. And I was really quite fascinated as I was doing some research about this thing, about the Clergy Project. They've got a Facebook page. They've got a 1-800 helpline for pastors, which is pretty cool. They've got a counseling service for pastors. You can become an official part of the Clergy Project for us pastors. And you have to fill out an application. And they have a 8-member kind of screening committee. And there's about 800 pastors so far. So it's not a huge organization yet, but there's about 800 pastors that are part of the Clergy Project. And one of the most notable is a guy named Bart Campolo. Now, you might recognize that name. His dad is that famous sociologist, a speaker, kind of an edgy guy, Tony Campolo. And Bart Campolo is one of the people who's part of the Clergy Project, which I found interesting. So Bart's story is that about 6 years ago, he was the envy of North American pastors of his generation. I mean, he was doing the conference circuit, he was writing books, he was pastoring an inner city ministry and having tremendous effect. And then one day he went out for a bike ride. And he was quite an avid bike rider, he had his helmet on the whole bit, but something happened. He was doing 40 miles an hour down a hill, and somehow he crashes, and he ends up in this near-death experience. And he is pulled from the brink of death, and he's in his recovery, and his recovery is going a little bit rough. And his wife, Marty, said to him one day when he was a little bit more recovered, she said, "You know what? I think maybe it's time that you stop being a professional Christian. I think you should stop being a professional Christian because let's face it, let's just be honest here. You no longer believe in God. You no longer believe that God created the world. You no longer believe in Jesus, that he rose from the dead and died for your sins, and neither do I. So why don't we just quit being Christians?" And on that day, officially, they stopped being Christians. They joined an atheist movement, and they signed up for the Clergy Project. You see, the Clergy Project is for pastors who no longer believe in God. And in fact, their statistics say that 71% of them have already left the church, but an amazing 29% are still pastoring, even though they don't believe in God. They just haven't come out yet to say that they don't believe in God. People who talk about the Clergy Project, and it was just featured in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, use this to indicate that Christianity is in crisis. That Christianity is on rocky ground, and that there's problems in Christianity. And I guess in some ways I would have to agree with them that I think that there are some challenges and there are some problems. They would say that those who believe in God, those who believe in the Bible, those who believe in Jesus, in the words of Professor Dr. Richard Dawkins, are enemies of reason, are slaves of superstition. Is that what we are? Are we enemies of reason? Are we slaves of superstition? They would have us believe that. However, I don't think that people renouncing their faith or reneging on their commitment to Christ is really the point of the crisis. I think Christianity, and many of us personally, are in crisis these days, but I think the crisis stems itself from the fact that we're sitting ducks. We're sitting ducks, and we are just waiting to get spiritually taken out because many of us don't know our theology. Many of us don't even know the reasons for our faith. And yet, there are tremendous reasons. It's not that our faith is undefendable. It's that we just don't know the reasons for our faith. And so over the next couple of weeks in our series, you're going to hear the words of the Apostle Peter many times. If you have a Bible, you can turn to it on your phone or just watch it on the screen. But here it is, 1 Peter 3:14-15. This is where our series is anchored in, and this is what it says. It says, "Don't let them frighten you. Don't let them frighten you. Don't be intimidated, but exalt him as Lord in your heart. Always be ready to offer a defense, humbly and respectfully, when someone asks you why you live in this hope that you live." Now, one of the most important words, one of the most interesting words to me in that passage is the word apologia. Apologia, or apologia, depends how you want to pronounce it. Apologia is basically Paul saying, listen, always, 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 no matter what circumstance or situation you find yourself in, no matter what conversation you find yourself in, always be apologia. Always be prepared. Always be apologetically primed and outfitted, ready to give an answer or a defense for your faith. This is where I think so many of us, we are not ready to give that answer. We have not studied. We have not thought about this. We have not wrestled it down, but rather we've gotten intimidated by our world. And Peter says, don't be intimidated. I think there's a tsunami of secular humanism that is slamming into our faith communities. And instead of running to higher ground, running those pathways to higher ground, many of us are just curling up in a corner, and we're just waiting for that tsunami to hit and wash us away, wash our faith away. But I think what we want to do in this series is we want to actually chart those pathways to higher ground. So today, in many ways, instead of giving up on our faith, this is a new era for many of us. This will become a defining line in the sand in many of us for many of our faith, because today we start doing the hard work, and it will be hard work. But we're going to start doing the hard work of figuring out what are the reasons behind our faith. We're going to get to work, and over the next 6 weeks, we are going to tackle 10 of the hardest, most difficult questions that atheists and humanists pose against Christianity and use to invalidate Christianity. We are going to prepare our minds. We are going to test our arguments. We're going to pack the backpacks of our faith with reasons so that when we are on the bus, when we are at work at a coffee break, and somebody asks us anything about our faith, we say, you know what, I'd love to have a discussion about that with you, and we're prepared to actually have a discussion. So in many ways, over the next 6 weeks, this is going to be like a faith boot camp, okay? In other words, this is going to be painful in some ways, okay? This is not going to be easy. We are going to push ourselves to ask some of these most difficult questions. It's not going to be easy. It is going to cause tension for some of us in our own beliefs and in our own faith. There's going to be some tension and dissonance, maybe in some of our conversations. It is going to stir up some hornet's nests. It is going to possibly raise the temperature of our worship communities, which will probably spill over to the temperature of our small group communities. And you're not going to agree with everything I have to say. You're not going to agree with everything that somebody else has to say in this series, and I hope you don't. I hope you test it. I hope you filter it through some filters. I hope you test it against scriptures. But we are going to work hard, and I can guarantee you that at the end of some of our messages, you're simply going to leave with a headache. All right, you're going to go, wow, like that, I was just thinking so hard trying to figure this out. But we're going to do the hard work of figuring out what are the reasons for our faith. Now, I don't want us to forget the last part of the second half of that verse. It says this, always be ready to offer a defense humbly and respectfully. Peter says, listen, when you get your arguments ready, when you're preparing your points of logic, when you're preparing for battle intellectually, philosophically, do it with meekness. Do it with humility. Do it with gentleness. And then he says, do it with phobos. Phobos. He actually says that word respectfully there is phobos. That's where we get the word phobia or fear. He says, do this with some fear and trepidation. Do this with some shaking in your boots. Realize that some things could fall off the rails. Realize that you could end up offending some people or maybe even keeping some people from the faith if you don't do this right. Have some fear going into this. Have some humility going into this. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover even today, so let's just jump right into the very first question, which is this: where did we and everything come from? Where did we and everything come from? Now, if you are on the tip of your tongue, the answer you want to give is, well, Genesis 1 and 2 says that God created the earth in 6 days, and then he rested, and so I guess my answer is God created it. If that is your answer, I think that's a great answer for Sunday school. I think that's a great answer for church. I think many of your people in your small group, if you gave that answer, would be nodding, yes, that is a wonderful answer. However, I don't think it's going to cut it when you're having a conversation with an atheist, or somebody who's agnostic, or someone who's just searching. I don't know that Genesis 1 and 2 says that God created it and God created the earth, and therefore, that's my answer. I don't know that that's a good enough answer. I don't know that we've done enough work to be able to enter the arena having a conversation about how this stuff really works. Now, it's not that I would disagree with you. It's not that I disagree with you. It's just that I think that there might be another direction to take on this. There might be some other ways of thinking about this. So here's the first thing I want you to write down. All of our worship communities, warehouse, fire hall, church hill, wherever you are, and here, I want you to write down a better answer because you're going to forget it, a few days from now, and I want you to have it written down somewhere. So here, I think, is a better answer to the question, where did we and everything come from? You ready? Here it is. I believe the evidence shows that God created the universe. That is a way better answer. Because what does it do? It instantly raises the question, doesn't it? What's the question? What evidence? Do you know the evidence? If somebody said, where did we and everything come from? And you said, well, I believe the evidence shows that, leans greatly to show that God created the universe. And they said, well, what evidence? Would you have an answer? Or would you apologetically say, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. I've never thought about that. We want you to be unapologetic. We want you to be bold and have something to say back. We want you to have thought through this a little bit. So that's what we're going to do today. Evidence number one, we're going to pack your backpack with 3 pieces of evidence. And here's evidence number one I would suggest is this. Whatever has a beginning has a cause. Whatever has a beginning has a cause. Now, in 1915, Albert Einstein published the general theory of relativity, way above my pay grade in terms of understanding or experience or being able to communicate the general theory of relativity. However, for the last 100 years, just about everybody universally has accepted that this is a true principle in physics and cosmology, is this relativity theory. Now, what we do know is that what he was basically saying was that the universe, which is made up of 4 elements, time, space, matter, and physical energy, the universe that we know, this equation says had a starting point. It had a beginning point, okay? To explain the science behind the starting point, scientists have come up with the Big Bang Theory. To understand the Big Bang Theory a little bit better, space.com gives us that definition. It says this: the Big Bang Theory is the leading explanation about how the universe began. At its simplest, it talks about the universe as we know it, starting with a small singularity that inflated over the next 13.8 billion years to the cosmos that we know today. Now, that sounds pretty impressive. That sounds pretty spectacular, and that sounds pretty ironclad, doesn't it? It sounds like it really is an awesome answer to the question, where did we come from? However, it begs a question. It begs another question, because Einstein's theory says you can't have an effect without a what? Without a cause. You can't have an effect without a cause. That's what the theory says. That's what the science says. You can't have an effect without the cause. In other words, let's run with this Big Bang Theory. Let's step into that world for a minute, and let's run with this for a minute, which basically the theory says that all the particles in the universe, all the energy in the universe, was all compressed down into this little dime-sized particle thing. And what it did, it was floating around in space for who knows how many billions of years, and then it exploded with a lot of light, a lot of energy, and it was a big bang. It exploded from that little dime-sized thing into everything that we know today. It just kept expanding for 13.9 billion years. Okay, let's run with that for a second, but Einstein's theory says you can't have an effect without a what? Without a cause. You can't have an effect without a cause, which raises the question, what? What's the cause? What was the cause? Okay, let's look at this and say this little dime-sized particle thing that was floating around for all these years, without time actually in space, so it's not even years, is basically a tiny firecracker. Okay, it's a tiny firecracker, and one day it was lit on fire and it exploded and it big bang and it became everything that we know today. That begs some questions, doesn't it? It begs questions like this. Well, where did the firecracker come from? You can't have an effect without a what? Without a cause. So where did the firecracker come from? Who lit the firecracker? Who caused this moment for this thing to go off? Why did it go off? Okay? And if the answer is, well, the firecracker was always there, is that an answer that satisfies you? No, it doesn't work for me. If the answer is, well, the firecracker formed itself. Well, no, that doesn't exactly work for me either, does it? Well, it happened without a cause. Well, that's a negation of the principle that everybody understands mathematically, that there has to be a cause if there's going to be effect. Well, one day it just appeared and it went off. I'm sorry, those are all cop-outs. Those are all cop-outs to the answer, how did the firecracker get there and who lit it on fire and how did it end up banging into what we know today? You might be surprised by how some of the leading scientists and atheists in the world answer that question when they are pushed on it. So Dr. Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, he gets a Skype question on an Australian program about this, and this is his answer. Take a look.
Question for Richard Dawkins. The Big Bangers believe that once there was nothing, then suddenly, poof, the universe was created from a Big Bang. If I have nothing in the palm of my hand, close my fingers, speak the word bang, then open my fingers again, still I find there is nothing there. I ask you to explain to us in layman's terms how it is that something as enormous as the universes came from nothing.
Richard Dawkins.
Well, obviously you're not a physicist, and nor... and nor am I, and I am delighted to say that during my time in Australia I shall be having a number of conversations, public conversations, with my colleague Lawrence Krauss, including one in the Sydney Opera House later, I think it's next week. And he's written a book on exactly that topic of how you can get something from nothing, and I shall be questioning him about that. Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. Now, if you want to replace a physical explanation by an intelligent God, that's an even worse explanation. It's an even more difficult explanation. What scientists are trying to do is to explain how you can get not just something, but the immense complexity of the world, of the universe, and of life. And science is making a pretty good fist of doing that. Life is now completely solved, barring the details. That was Darwin's contribution and Darwin's successors. Physicists are still working on the origin of the cosmos. Among them is Lawrence Krauss, whom I shall be talking to next week. Now, it is very mysterious how the universe came into being. It's a deeply mysterious and interesting question.
And can I just interrupt? It's an old question, a very old question. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was asking this same question. He said there must have been a time when no physical things existed, but something can't come from nothing. That was his view. It's just been repeated by us.
Something can come from nothing, and that's what physicists are now telling us. I could give you, you asked me to give you a layman's interpretation. It would be a very, very layman's interpretation. When you have matter and antimatter and you put them together, they cancel each other out and give rise to nothing. What Lawrence Krauss is now suggesting is that if you start with nothing, the process can go into reverse and produce matter and antimatter. The theory is still being worked out. It's a very difficult theory, mathematical theory. I'm not qualified to answer the question, but what I am sure about is that it most certainly is not solved by postulating an intelligence, a creative intelligence, who raises even bigger questions of his own existence. That certainly is not going to be the answer, whatever else is.
I don't know what you're hearing there, but that's fascinating to me, okay? First of all, he sounds very confident. He's got incredible credentials. It's a bunch of baloney, okay? Life is not solved. Ask any other scientists. They have not got this thing figured out. There's so much that they don't know. Life is not solved. And I would have expected a much clearer scientific answer. Now, you're going to hear a name, William Lane Craig. He's an apologist. He's a phenomenal guy. And he was in a debate with Dr. Peter Adkins, who is a chemistry professor of Oxford. Adkins has 30 textbooks out on chemistry. He's world-renowned. He's brilliant. When he was pressed on the question of how did this whole nothing thing work and where does stuff come from, here's his answer.
There is nothing here. I will concede that. But it's an extremely interesting form of nothing. There was nothing originally. There is nothing here now, but it's through whatever event took place at the inception of the universe, it became an interesting form of nothing, which seems to be something.
Okay, I don't know. Like this is the most brilliant scientists in the world. This is their explanation. There was nothing. There is nothing now. But it's an interesting nothing, which means that it's something. Dr. Lewis Wolpert, famous developmental biologist, challenged by William Lane Craig again on William Lane Craig is saying God created the universe, and Wolpert says, no, it wasn't God, it was something else. Here's his answer. He was willing to go on the record with this answer of why the universe exists and where it came from.
I think it's a computer.
Well, that wouldn't, computers are designed by people.
No, this is a self-designing computer.
Timeless.
Timeless.
Well, that's a contradiction in terms.
Why is it time? What's contradictory about it?
A computer has to function, it takes
Oh,
time.
no, this is a special computer.
Yeah, but it has to be logically coherent.
Oh, it's logically coherent.
Yes, you have to be
Oh,
logically
no,
coherent.
this
And
computer
besides-
is amazing.
No, besides, it would have to be, as I said, a personal being.
No.
And a computer is a physical
Not this computer.
object.
Oh,
Well, then,
no.
Okay, see, what you're doing is what you're calling a computer is really God. A non-physical, It's just another word if you rob it of all the attributes that make it a computer.
Now, you might laugh and think, this guy actually thinks that a computer started this whole thing? It's a theory. It is one of the legitimate theories. After watching some of the leading atheists, world-renowned leading atheist scientists, my conclusion was this: any attempt to answer the question of where everything came from requires a leap of faith. It requires a leap of faith. Whether you're going to go with their theories or you're going to go with the biblical theory, there is faith required for any of this. If you think that this scientific community is unified with their ironclad reasons and science that tells us where the origins of the universe came from, you are mistaken. They cannot agree with one another, and they've got some fantastical theories. In fact, in an article in Smithsonian Magazine, what they did is they listed the different theories, and here they are. Nothing came from nothing theory. The second theory that they said many scientists are kind of looking at right now is that the universe is a hologram. It's just a projection. It's not real. It's a projection of something else from somewhere else. Thirdly, the universe is a computer simulation. This is a real theory, that we're living in the Matrix. We're living a computer game right now in somebody's computer, and that's what life really is. Other scientists are talking about the universe being a black hole. Others, the universe is a bubble. Our universe is a bubble in an ocean of universes. It's called the multiverse. In other words, there's parallel universes out there. There's no room for God in these theories, but there's parallel universes completely outside of ours. And whatever the cause was, they say it was self-creating, it was self-initiating, it was random and accidental and out of nothing. Now, I don't buy it. I mean, I realize that I'm no Einstein, but I still don't buy it. If something is going to happen, if there was an event that was going to happen, if there was an effect that was going to happen, it has to have a what? It has to have a cause. It has to have a cause. And I would challenge Dawkins and Atkins and Wolpert and Stephen Hawking and Dr. Neil Tyson and all these others that have you explored the universe exhaustively? Have you been able to look everywhere to prove that there is no God? How much of the universe have you actually explored? How much knowledge do you actually think you have in comparison to the rest of the universe? Let me put it this way. I was driving around about 6 months ago, and I heard on the radio on CBC that the number of galaxies has been estimated wrong. Up until now, the common theory was that there was 200 billion galaxies in the universe. And that with that, there was about 10 to the power 24 planets in the universe, okay, in the known universe. They came out, scientists are coming out right now, it came out on the radio about 6 months ago. Whoops, we got the number wrong. Our estimate was a little low. It's actually 5 times that, and it's a trillion. It's a trillion galaxies and 10 times that many planets. Now, let me put this into perspective by saying this. Any idea how many planets that represents in the known universe, their estimate? 1.4 quadrillion planets. Planets, not galaxies, not stars, planets, okay? 1.4, I'm using their science, okay? Their science says 1.4 quadrillion planets. Now, if the population of Earth, which is about 7 billion, if each of us was given an equal number of those planets, how many planets would that be? If you had a set of planets that were yours in the known universe and I had some that were mine, how many planets will we have? Well, let me put it this way. If you were to count one of your planets every second and never sleep, it would take you 45,229,702 years just to count your planets that belong to you, not to mention the other 7 billion people, okay? My point being, Dawkins, Atkins, all of you folks, doesn't it seem a little bit arrogant and maybe a little bit premature for this gaggle of brilliant minds to conclude there is no God? In this universe, there is no God, and we can prove it. We are certain of it. I mean, let me put it this way. Let's say we were standing on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. This is probably a cruel picture to show you, but here we are on the shores of the Pacific, okay? And I'm there with Dawkins and Atkins and all these guys, and I take there's one of those red plastic beer cups laying on the shore. And so I go over and I take the red plastic beer cup, I scoop it into the ocean, I get a cup full of water, and I use with the help of these guys, the world's most powerful microscope to study the water that's in this cup. And then I take the world's most powerful telescope to look out on the ocean. And when I'm done my study, I say, I conclude that there is conclusively no whales in the ocean. From my study of what I have studied here and there, I will conclude there is no such thing as a whale in the ocean. What would be your response? Your response would be, hold it a second, that's an incredibly small sampling. It's only one little cup, and you can only see 5 kilometers, and then the ocean drops off. What about the fact that the ocean is 10 kilometers deep in places, that there's 361 million square kilometers on the surface of the ocean? There are caves and mountains and trenches. Isn't it a little bit premature and a little bit arrogant to say that there are no whales in the ocean? There's no such thing as a whale in the ocean based on our studies. I think it's incredibly premature. And yet that's what atheist scientists would have us believe. Now, you need to realize that even the atheist scientists admit that about half the scientists are theists. About half the scientists in the world believe in God. Okay, you don't maybe hear that a lot, but I was listening to an atheist scientist that acknowledged that the other day. So, evidence number 1 is the word cause. You need to remember, wherever there's an effect, there's got to be a cause. Push into what was the cause. Evidence number 2, the universe is fine-tuned with impossible precision. The universe is fine-tuned with impossible precision. Now, some of you that aren't into pushing your brains and thinking about this and science and stuff, stick with me, okay? Because there's going to be something valuable here for you. So let's do the hard work together. Let's allow our brains to hurt a little bit. But let me explain the evidence, and then I'm going to give you an illustration. So I don't understand all the evidence, but in Cosmos magazine, they basically, it's not a Christian magazine or website at all. It's atheistic. It's humanistic. They basically say, listen, if we were to tinker with some of the forces in the universe, we've discovered that there's an incredibly low tolerance for deviation. Okay, these aren't Christians talking. This is just your raw science. Okay, and so what they do is they list out 34 different key forces in the universe that if you tinkered with them, we'd be in trouble. But they only talk about 3 in the article. Protons and electron ratio, the Goldilocks expansion rate of the universe, which is not too fast and not too slow. That's why they call it Goldilocks. And the symmetry of protons to antiprotons. Crazy stuff. I don't understand it all. But here's what I read in the article. They said if we were to take just one of those forces, okay, stick with me. We're going to take just one of those forces, the ratio of protons and electrons, and we were to monkey and deviate the ratio just a little bit. How much, in other words, if we had a screwdriver, and we were going to, turn it 1/4, 0.25 degrees, or around the circle, how much could we actually tinker with these little electrons before we wouldn't have a universe? And they figured it out, and they said, well, actually, the number is 10 to the power 37. Not a quarter, not a half turn, but 10 to the power 37th turn. That's how much you could deviate from this force between these electrons before you would not have a universe and you would not have life. Okay? Incredibly, incredibly small, right? So there's this a Canadian astrophysicist which says he's trying to explain this whole thing, and he says, well, that is such an incredibly small number of deviation. Like, it's so exact on. He says, how do we understand this number, 10 to the power of 37? He says, let me explain that number to you. He says, if you had dimes and you stacked the dimes across North America, the entire North America, Canada, U.S., Mexico, you covered it in dimes, and then you stacked those dimes to the moon, 239,000 miles. That's how high the stacks are, all dimes. And then you took that continent and you found 1 billion other continents exactly the same size and stacked them all to the moon. And then you had your good buddy spray paint one of the dimes red, and you blindfolded him, you threw it into the dimes, and you messed them all up, and you said, you get to pick one dime. What are the chances of picking out that dime? North America, stacked to the moon, 1 billion North Americas, and one dime. That's 10 to the power of 37. He says the universe is insanely, precisionally tuned, and that was only one force out of 34. The chances that this happened by accident. Cosmos magazine, though, interesting enough, at the end of the article they said, well, now you might be tempted to think that this is an argument for God, that God created this because it's so finely tuned. Here was their answer. Perhaps we are just self-aware programs running on some cosmic computer. How would you know? Supercomputers can simulate the workings of the universe from subatomic to cosmic scale. In other words, what they're saying is we are just a little world on Horton's dandelion. We're in some other universe on somebody else's computer, and we are just in this little world. And that was their answer, as opposed to the answer being, there must have been an intelligent life form that actually tuned this thing because it's so incredible. These theories that are proposed really, really challenge our minds, and they are very fantastical. And I would say personally, it takes more faith to believe some of these theories than it does to believe in a creator God. Dr. Fred Hoyle, an astronomer from Cambridge, coined the term in 1949, the Big Bang. He didn't agree with it, but he coined the term, and he was not a Christian. He was not a creationist. He was none of those things. He was just a humanist scientist. But he said the chances of this world coming, even a single cell being formed by accident, are astronomical. He used to compare it to a tornado going through a junkyard and by the end of it assembling a 747 jet plane. So let's expand on that a little bit more, because we know a little more since we do 1949. Let's use our imaginations a little bit. Let's say there was an F6 tornado, and we'll just build the parameters a bit. Let's say there was an F6 tornado that hit the ground in New York City and traveled all the way across the United States to San Francisco. And along the way, this F6 tornado hit every steel plant, every electronic manufacturer, every engineering firm, rubber plant, foam plant, plastic plant, and glass plant, all the way from New York to San Francisco. What are the chances that when it finally petered out in San Francisco and went back into the clouds, that it would leave on the runway of San Francisco a fully operational, fully flyable, fully safe Boeing 747? The chances are like nil. And the atheists might come back and say, well, hold it a second, you're not factoring in the billions of years that this had a chance to work itself out. I say, okay, great, let's run that tornado back and forth 100 times across the United States. 100 times it's going back and forth, F6, going to every plant, everything that would be needed. What are the chances that at the end it would assemble a little Swiss watch? What are the chances that that tornado would assemble a Volkswagen? What are the chances that it would assemble a laptop? How about a salamander? How about a baby human being? What are the chances that that tornado would assemble a baby human being? The simple fact remains, where there is an effect, there is a cause. The universe is insanely finely tuned. In other words, where there's a design, there needs to be a designer. And one final bit of evidence that I would offer to you, and I know we're hurting our brains already, but stick with me on this one, is evidence number 3. Without God, there is no objective moral code. Without God, there is no objective moral code. Now, there are, of course, people who, much better than me, much smarter than me, can argue, have arguments and studies and research and debates way above my pay grade that will challenge these thoughts. However, that doesn't mean that we're not allowed to study them or to know about them or to form opinions about them. Atheists will argue that there is no objective moral code. There is no moral code. Okay? In other words, everything that we know to be good and right and valuable is merely a product of the survival of the fittest biological processes. biochemical processes. That's all that this good, knowing, value system, right, wrong sort of thing is. That there is no universal morals imprinted upon human beings. And they say this is basically herd morality, okay? So in other words, it does the human race good not to murder one another. It does the human race good not to rape and violate and steal. That's why we have these moral objectives, because it's good biologically, it's good in terms of evolutionary. That's why these things come from. However, the implications of this are mind-boggling. To say that there is no such thing as objective moral code is absolutely mind-boggling. If naturalism is true, then that guy that stabbed the 13-year-old girl in Abbotsford just before Christmas and murdered her, that guy was not guilty of anything more serious than acting unfashionably. He simply kind of stepped out of the herd. That's all. That's all he did. He just wasn't going with where the rest of the people were going. He did nothing more than that. If naturalism is true and it's just biology and chemistry and reactions, then for some gang to kidnap children and teenagers, to rape and torture them, to get them hooked on heroin, and then to sell them to the sex trade, and then to use them as sex slaves for 5 years before they murder them, there's nothing wrong with that if there's no objective moral code, other than the fact that the rest of the herd doesn't like it. There's nothing wrong with that. The inherent value of children, then, is no different than that mouse you caught in your garage in the fall. That mouse you caught and killed in your garage, they have no more value because they're just biology. They're just chemistry. That's all they are. So it really doesn't matter. If naturalism is true, then Hitler and all he did to exterminate the Jews and the gypsies, it can be explained biologically. It was just survival of the fittest. That's all it was. It was nothing more than that. There's no moral opinion that you can form against that. It was not evil and it was not wrong, because all it is biology and chemistry, survival of the fittest. They just wanted their nation to excel. That's all. In fact, pushed to the limits, I would say that if naturalism is true, then a leading atheist, his wife and children could be kidnapped and tortured and raped and beheaded, and that atheist standing at their gravesides at the funeral, all he would be able to say is, whatever. They were accidentally formed, clumps of biochemical material and processes. Whoever did this went outside the human herd, obviously. But that's what biology does, survival of the fittest. It's not their universal moral imprinting upon their non-material selves. Torture, rape, and murder aren't wrong. It was just unfashionable, and who am I to judge? Now, can you imagine anybody thinking that towards their wife and children? The fact is that there are, I believe, objective moral codes imprinted upon our souls and upon our personalities, and that directly points us to how does biology and chemistry and primordial soup and evolution, how does that produce objective moral codes if they're really there? If there is an objective moral code, and I would say there is, then it had to come from somewhere. And where did it come from? Because biological cells do not create love and right and wrong and morality. Evidence number one that I want to put in your backpack is whatever has a beginning has a cause. Evidence number two is that the universe is fine-tuned with impossible precision. Evidence number three is that without God, there is no objective moral code. Now, I admit I'm way out of my element on this whole apologetics thing, so I've been studying like crazy. A book I picked up is An Atheist and a Christian Walk into a Bar. It's by a Christian and an atheist, and they actually have a conversation. It's a great book. It's very readable. They actually have a conversation. In fact, I was so intrigued by this, I contacted the theologian, Dr. Randall Rouser, and I said, hey, would you talk to Riverwood a little bit about your perspective on apologetics? Well, Dr. Rouser, thanks for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be with you. Let me begin by commending Riverwood for taking this step of taking the time to look at apologetics.
So you're sitting on a bus going to school or going to work or whatever, and somebody next to you says, listen, when are you going to give up your fairy tale, beliefs, and you're going to look at science, and you're going to start believing in evolutionary science the way that everybody else does? How do you respond to them?
Well, I guess a couple things I might say. First thing is, we always have to try to identify when people really are interested in listening. And sometimes people aren't willing or ready to take you seriously. And if they're going to begin by using kind of very strong rhetorical language, like referring to Christianity as a fairy tale, that may not be quite the moment to launch into an extended defense of Christianity. It may be better at that point just to build a relationship with this person, understand a little bit better what makes them tick, and maybe why they're so hostile to Christianity.
So that's really interesting. So we don't have to feel like we have to come up with this brilliant answer right off the bat. Actually take a step back and look at maybe if you can see any of the motives. I love that. So if this person, said, okay, well, listen, what's your answer for where the universe came from?
Well, it's an interesting, because that's an ambiguous question. So I'd want to know what that person meant. If they meant in terms of the scientific theory, I would say, well, when it comes to cosmology, I would defer to the main model of cosmology today, which is Big Bang cosmology, not least because that seems to be the consensus today, but also because I'm outside of my element. I'm not a cosmologist myself. Christians have always had a diversity of opinions on how to understand how Genesis 1 and 2, or Genesis 1, 2, and 3 relate to the current scientific theories of the day. And you've also long had a diversity of opinions on how to understand Darwinian theory and how that might relate or might not relate to Christian accounts of origins. So in the 1860s, Asa Gray was a well-known evangelical Protestant. He was also a scientist, and he was the main promoter of Darwin's theory in North America. And ever since the 1860s, you've had some Christians who have defended evolution. Certainly the Catholic Church embraces evolution. The Orthodox Church does. Many other communions do as well. Some evangelical Protestant churches don't. But I would say the first thing or the second thing is Christians disagree on that. So you can be a Christian and believe that God created by evolutionary processes.
So how would you possibly argue against the weight of scientific evidence that says that life began in this primordial soup and naturally evolved 3.9 billion years ago? I mean, do you argue against that, or do you accept that?
Well, I would sort of, in a sense, go between those options. I would say a Christian doesn't have to have an opinion on that issue. As I already said, there are and have always been Christians who have accepted some form of neo-Darwinian evolution. So for me, I don't have to take a stand on whether or not neo-Darwinian evolution is true, because I think that Christianity is true irrespective of whether evolution is true. And what I like to say is that sometimes, certainly in the evangelical tradition that I've known all my life, there's a very strong emphasis upon having certainty of your convictions. And there's often been a suspicion or a caution about doubt. And what I would want to say is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with having doubts. Let me put it this way. So I like to give this illustration. There's a couple guys flying in this bush plane in the northern woods, and then the plane crashes into the forest. And they're waiting to be rescued, and they're lying there in the snow-covered forest. And the one guy says, I can't feel my body anymore. I'm just lying here in the snow, and I have no pain. I'm just sort of this placid feeling, and I think I'm just going to go to sleep now. The other guy says, I feel pain in all my limbs, and I'm in agony. Now, of those two people, I think the second guy is much better off because his body is still communicating to him. And I know many people in the church over the years who are like that first guy, that their faith is asleep. They're not really wrestling with things. I know other people that have all sorts of doubts and questions, and they wrestle with them. And I think that is a sign of spiritual health. Now, I also don't want to say that you have to have doubts, because I know people who are perfectly fine in their faith and they don't have doubts. I would just want to say that we shouldn't stigmatize people who do have doubts, because that can be part of a very healthy Christian journey. And I think that what Riverwood is doing is just very admirable, because by being a community that is open to these questions and conversations, I think you are positioning yourself very effectively to meet the person who defines themselves as spiritual but not religious.
Randall, thank you so much for sharing with us, for teaching us today, for spurring us on, and just being generous with your time. We sure appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, and blessings to you and to Riverwood.
So Dr. Rausser's book is going to be available at our Apologetics conference, and it's a great read. He actually has 3 other books as well. So let's wrap up with a couple of thoughts. Dr. Rausser, one of the things that he did is he helped bring a much more relational, kind of chilled approach to apologetics for me, which was really helpful, that we don't have to have all the answers. It's okay to have some doubt, and I thought that was really helpful. However, I do want to conclude with this. Most times, this argument is pitted as science against faith. Most times, it's characterized as science against God. And I want to suggest to you that that is not true. That's not true at all. I love science. I'm not very good at it. I'm not super studying in it, but in terms of science and what scientists do, I love it. I love when they press in and they're honest and they're daring and they're in their pursuit of how stuff works. But where science gets into trouble is when it makes the leap to speculate on things that it is not in its area of expertise and it has no business speculating on. And when it does that, it turns into a religion. It's the religion, really, of scientism. Richard Dawkins has kind of crossed the line from scientist to evangelistic atheist. He shows his cards all the time. Our fight isn't with science. Don't allow people to make you think that the fight is with science. Our objection or debate or fight is with another faith. This is faith against faith. It's those who have faith in what they think are their theories about science, and those who have faith in the Bible. Our one theory and belief against another theory and belief, and I personally can't muster enough faith to be an atheist. That's kind of the bottom line for me. Now, we're just launching today. We got 9 more incredibly thought-provoking questions. Next week, we're going to take on how can you worship a God who commits genocide? That'll be an interesting one. The week after that, how is believing in Jesus different than believing in an invisible pink unicorn? And then on February 3 and 4, Friday night from 7 to 10, and Saturday morning from 9 to noon, we're holding our first ever unapologetic conference, and it's going to be awesome. So I do have the feeling that we're going to sell out. Registrations are open as of today. Adults, $25. We kept it incredibly cheap. If you are a university or college student, $20. If you're a high school student, $10. If you want to come at the door and there's still room left, $35. We certainly encourage you to register online or at the Welcome Center. We have Steve Kim from Apologetics Canada, Vancouver, coming in. Dan Rutherford, who's moved from Victoria to Winnipeg. He's an author, a pastor, and a businessman who's going to be there. Alexander Grant is going to be leading worship. If you think that apologetics is boring and all theoretical, we're going to amp it up. We're going to have some fun. We're going to worship. In fact, there's an after-party worship that night with Alexander Grant and his band. It's going to be a really rockin' awesome weekend, and we would love for you to be there. I realize we're over a little bit, but I do think I want to end with one scripture. I want to bookend our time with scripture. Here we are, Romans chapter 1, verse 16. Let it wash over you. Here's what it says. For I am not the least bit embarrassed about the gospel. I won't shy away from it, because it's God's power to save every person who believes, and as we will see, it begins with and ends with faith. People are not ignorant about what can be known of God, because he has shown it to them with great clarity. From the beginning, creation in its magnificence enlightens us to his nature. Creation itself makes his undying power and divine identity clear, even though they're invisible, and it voids the excuses and ignorant claims of those people. Let's pray together as one worship community. Heavenly Father, We've launched our boot camp. We've taken on these tough questions. Some of our brains are hurting already. But God, I pray that you would help us to give ourselves to the hard work of understanding the reasons behind our faith. God, I pray that you would embolden us, that you would help us to be unapologetic, and that this series, each week, even as we invite friends to come explore with honesty these questions, and our conference, God, would just be glorifying to you and just bolster our spirits, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, before the other sites go, I just want to say really quick, register for the Apologetics Conference. It's going to be awesome. Secondly, if you are not in a small group, in the next week or two, they're wrapping up their sign-ups, and we've got a catalog for you at Small Group Central. Here we've got prayer team. I'm going to just say goodbye to Warehouse and Churchill and to Fire Hall and all those listening online. God bless you. Have a great week.